Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Econ Playground. I just wanted to, before you watch the conversation we're about to have about Cameron Harwick's paper, Morality is Fractal, just to say two things. Some of the paper gets kind of technical with certain aspects of Mandelbrot sets and complex numbers and things like that. So if you'd like, before watching or listening to our conversation, look at some of the links I've put in the description below to some videos that'll just basically introduce you to the mathematical concepts we're going to talk about. And I'd also want to just mention that Matt Kelly, who I mentioned in the video, is not able to turn on his video. So if you hear a disembodied voice in the background, that's Matthew Kelly. So go ahead and check out those links and check out the link to Cameron's paper that we're going to be talking about, and then enjoy the conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Econ Playground. My name is Marcus, as you know, and today I'm very happy to have some friends here to discuss a paper by Cameron Harwick called Morality as a Fractal. We'll be linking it in the description below in case you'd want to read the paper before listening to our conversation. Cameron is an associate professor at SUNY Brockport, where he studies monetary theory, evolutionary economics, and complexity economics, and usually Cameron has some sort of anthropological flair to his research, I've noticed. I've also got two other friends with me, one who's been on the channel before, one who hasn't. The one who hasn't is Kurtis Hingle. He's a third-year student at GMU studying the Industrial Organization of Science. Kurtis and I have another paper that we've been working on together for a while now, and it's very much related to Cameron's paper, so I thought having him on board would be a lot of fun. And last but not least, we've got Matt Kelly, who's an assistant professor of finance at Campbell University. He's an expert in the uranium industry, and he's also proficient at Microsoft Excel. And he knows a lot about these kind of topics, so we're really happy to have him here. And so Cameron's just going to start giving us a little bit of an explanation of his paper with some visuals and stuff. So take it away, Cameron.
All right, well, thanks so much for having me on. So this is a paper about something that all of you guys are also interested in, which is the incompleteness of formal rule sets. And this is going to include things like social norms, things like moral rules, legal rules, contracts, any kind of thing like that. And so the basic argument of the paper is that the boundary of applicability of any kind of rule in any of these situations is going to be fractal. That is to say that any infinitesimal detail can potentially matter in a way that can't be predicted in advance. So for example, if we think of the applicability of a rule like you can move a chess piece, right? That only applies in the game of chess. But even rules with a really large domain of applicability, like thou shalt not kill, right? We recognize exceptions to this, like self-defense. So imagine that you're on a jury, and the question before you is, was this death wrongful or was it self-defense? Does this count as murder or self-defense? And it's not going to be possible for you to enumerate in advance a list of necessary and sufficient conditions for that to count or to have counted as self-defense. That could hinge on something as small a signal as the size of a glove. And if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit, right? So I'll talk a little bit about the formal argument here, just because I know that this is relevant to some of the things that you guys are working on too. So there's basically two moving parts in this formalization. That's going to be the idea of signal space and the idea of decision space and the way those two interact. So signal space I'm thinking of as all the observable characteristics of a situation, any kind of situation that I might be in. And we'll think of this as an infinite list of zeros and ones. For example, right now, I'm sitting in front of a computer on Zoom. That takes a 1. I'm talking to Marcus and Kurtis and Matt. That takes 3 ones. Marcus is not wearing a pink hat, and so that takes a 0. So any kind of conceivable situation I could be in is represented this way. And we're going to project that to a 4x4 square in complex space. It might seem like a weird thing to do, but we'll see the payoff to that shortly. So once we project this, we'll call this signal space. Any point in this 4x4 complex square is going to represent some kind of situation, and points that are farther apart are going to be more different situations. So From any given situation, I can make some kind of decision, right? And different situations will have different sets of decisions that make sense for me. For example, if I'm standing in the bathroom about to take a shower, taking off my shirt is a sensible decision. Right now, sitting on Zoom, taking off my shirt is probably not a sensible decision, right? So there's boundaries of applicability of that decision. So we're going to think of decisions as a function. And that function is going to take you from a point in signal space, some situation, and move you to a new one. We're going to restrict the set of decisions to functions of the form z squared plus c. And the reason we do that, we don't have to do this. It could be really any rational function we could use there. But z squared plus c is going to allow us to visualize our decision space, because c is going to be a complex point. And all of the functions we care about can be represented by, again, a 4x4 square. And so that's going to be some infinite set of decisions. We could have different exponents, doesn't matter. We just get more axes of symmetry, but doesn't matter. So let me show you how we are going to visualize this. I'll share my screen here. Okay. So on the right is signal space, 4x4 square. And at a point in signal space, this blue point, can you see my mouse or just the...
Yeah, we can see the mouse.
Okay, good. So at this blue point, this is some situation I might be in. On the left here is all the decisions that are valid from that point. And we're going to think of a valid decision or a sensible decision as being one that I can iterate. I can repeat it over and over and it makes sense for me. And if that converges either to a limit cycle or to a fixed point, then we're going to say that that's a viable decision. If that blows up to infinity, then we're going to say that shows that that is a decision that cannot be repeated. That's probably not a wise decision to make there. So the black area on the left here is all the decisions that are viable from this blue point situation over here. And on the other hand, this black area in signal space is all the situations that the decision in red can be applied at any situation in black. And so if you choose a different point in signal space, let's move to a situation over here, and you get a different set of decisions that are viable. And the further out you go, the smaller the decision space is, the fewer decisions are viable there. And similarly, the more central you are within decision space, the larger the set of situations that you can apply that in. This would be a rule like thou shalt not kill. You can apply that basically anywhere, right? But as I move out, especially toward the edge, now we get much weirder shapes. We get smaller shapes with these fractal boundaries. Now, what does this show us? On the right here, the right is what we're going to call a stability locus. These are the situations in which it makes sense to apply a decision over and over and over again. And the further out we go with more and more esoteric decisions, that stability locus gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, the boundary of that stability locus is what's called the Julia set. And the Julia set is defined as a set of points where in the neighborhood of that point, iteration generates chaotic behavior. What does that mean? That means if you are near the boundary, then any movement in any direction, any given signal can move you in or out of that stability locus and make it a good or a bad decision unpredictably, right? So the Julius set is fractal, which is to say it's infinitely detailed. The length of that boundary is infinitely long. And humans can't really do a whole lot with infinitely long things. So the next thing I do is I talk about resolution. And if we think of resolution as, let's say, the maximum number of signals that I can pay attention to in any given situation, right? Right now, I'm paying attention to the fact that that I'm on Zoom, the folks I'm talking with, but I'm not necessarily paying attention necessarily to the direction that Kurtis's hair is combed, right? That's not a thing that I need to pay attention to, right? So what I show is that the length of the description of the boundary of the Julia set increases in proportion to the resolution times the fractal dimension of the Julia set. Now, I'll share this one more time to show you the fractal dimension. What you can see is that for central decisions, this looks like a pretty easy shape, right? There's not a whole lot going on the edges. And if I do 0, 0, the Julia set is literally a circle. But as I go toward the edge, the boundary gets more and more complicated. And fractal dimension basically is a measure of the complexity of the boundary. And the further out we go, the more and more complex that boundary gets. And so descriptions, finite length descriptions of that boundary are going to increase in length faster the farther out we go. And that gives us a sense of the dynamics of institutions, for example, right? One of the things I mentioned here is the the length of the Code of Federal Regulations seems to rise at a reasonably steady pace for something like the last 50 years. Now, if you think of a regulator, for example, the EPA, let's think of this best case scenario. The EPA has a substantive goal in mind, like care for the environment. But the EPA cannot mandate that I care about the environment. The EPA can mandate that I do particular things or don't do particular things or fine me for doing particular things. And the mapping between that and good environmental outcomes is going to be a fractal boundary. And I'm going to have opportunities to signal formal compliance while substantively accomplishing my own goals in ways that the EPA might not want me to do. So what's going to be necessary is this kind of cat and mouse game in any kind of adversarial games where I'm looking for these points in signal space where I'm accomplishing my substantive goals, but I'm still within the EPA's finite length rule set. And the EPA is going to have to increase its resolution of signals that it looks at over time to try to deal with that situation. I also talk about similar situations with, for example, imagine you're a loan officer or an investor, and this draws on some previous work on blockchain finance that I've done with Jim Caton. You're not going to be able to come up with a checklist of necessary and sufficient conditions for approving a loan or for investing in a stock based on observable signals, right? And that's going to be infinitely long eventually if you try. I also talk about, for example, the evolution of altruism, which depends on the ability of cooperators to recognize each other. How do I know whether you are a cooperator and therefore whether I should cooperate with you, irrespective of whether or not you're going to cooperate back with me, but are you the kind of person who would? And there's game theoretic literature showing that that is an evolutionarily stable strategy, even though it's not a Nash equilibrium, if and only if cooperators can assort with each other and recognize each other. And of course, that leads to this kind of arms race dynamic where defectors want to get in under the radar, And cooperators need to get smarter to try to detect that, which drives the defectors to get smarter, and so on and so forth. And I guess the last thing I'll talk about here is two conceptions of learning. So you might wonder uh, how humans manage cooperation at all, if there's always going to be these edge cases where you can zoom into this little fractal hole that's not covered by the finite length rule. And if you're looking at some given finite resolution, then that's always going to be true. But what humans seem to do is uh, to not give down rules as necessary and sufficient conditions, right? Even very, very explicit legal norms are not fully explicit. There's a lot of load-bearing fuzzy concepts like negligence, right? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be judged as negligent? I don't know, right? That's a matter of judgment. And judgment seems to be a situation where learning happens analogically. You perceive a situation as a whole, not as a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. And so I'm thinking of this in terms of the formalization. Maybe you think of a distance measure in the spatial coordinate rather than a Hamming distance measure of your explicit signals. And that does seem to be basically how neural architecture works, right? That seems to be more fundamental to neural architecture, is this learning and classification by analogy, this holistic analogy rather than by necessary and sufficient conditions. And so one of the things that might be worth exploring is one of the previous paper I mentioned with Jim Caton is about the limits of algorithmic, or of doing any kind of this thing algorithmically, but how much of it could be done with, for example, neural networks, which seem to be doing something similar to what human brains are doing, taking a whole situation and then encoding situations analogically using neural weights. So I'll go ahead and end there, and then I'll be interested to hear your guys' thoughts.
Okay, thanks, Cameron. I guess the first question I want to ask is just to make sure that I understand exactly how the different parts of the mathematics are then analogized to the actual decisions that people are making, things like that. So
Mhm.
the idea of it seems like what's most important is the idea of whether or not a certain point in the decision set and the signal space, or the decision space and the signal space, whether they cycle with one another, right? And for anyone
Yeah.
that's not familiar, I guess, with the math, what I'll do is I'll also link some videos to Three Blue, One Brown, who has pretty good descriptions of this stuff. Kurtis shared those with me when I first sent him Cameron's paper. And so if there's a cycle between the decision space and the signal space, then when I observe a signal, I should expect a certain decision to be done in response, and then that decision will create a signal that will create a decision that'll create a signal that all balance themselves in some way, such that I don't need to know an infinite number of things, or I don't need to know an infinite number of ways that this process cycles to get a general sense of what decisions are going to be done. So this signal actually generates predictability for me. Whereas if there's a chaotic cycle, then there's no algorithm, even possibly no algorithm that has infinite time to compute, such that I could actually predict every single decision that's going to be made, given that this rule set is followed in some sense. So for the economist, we are sort of restricting this thought experiment to, if the rule was followed, this is what decisions people would be taking. But as we know in econ, people have the choice to defect from rules all the time anyway, right? So what you're merely saying is that if you make an analogy between signal space and rules, that is, when people observe this signal, they will follow this decision. Rules are in a number of cases, specifically these boundary cases you're talking about, insufficient to generate predictions about what other people are going to do. That's essentially what you're saying, and that's how it's analogized to the math.
Yeah, and I would say there's two different things going on there. There's the question of whether a given decision will diverge after iteration, and that's divergence, not necessarily chaotic behavior. The chaotic behavior arises at that boundary where if you change one signal, any signal, then chaotic behavior means that changing one signal changes it completely unpredictably, whether it diverges or doesn't diverge. But you're right that converging to a fixed point or a limit cycle means that that decision is going to be predictable.
Hmm. Okay, anything else from the other guys? And we could just talk as long as you want.
That last point was something I was going to raise, is just the difference between cycling and divergence is an important one. Um, maybe early on in the paper, just for the members of your audience that that aren't as familiar with, how the Mandelbrot set is defined mathematically as this iterative function, sort of a some some time spent briefly covering that might be worthwhile. Just kind of laying out, like, here's literally the iterative function. Here's how the rule works, and maybe even kind of uh, maybe even like an example of starting from a starting point Z and setting C somewhere in the plane can kind of help illustrate that, like just kind of iterate it forward 3 or 4 times. I think that I like you in you describe that in the general perfectly well. It's just for illustrative purposes, might be useful for some of your audience. um but there were I'm trying to think of where to, um because I have a few questions here. There's an interesting, so like the logistic map, right, is a an idea uh, that I think complexity, scientists and people are often familiar with. And there's this, I don't know how obscure it is necessarily, but the the and I'm going to sort of butcher this and speak very inexactly about this, but the logistic map kind of is the Mandelbrot set. Like you, it's or it's sort of one cross section of it, um, in the in just the in the real domain. Again, I'm kind of speaking inexactly, but laying that out for people might be useful also, because the logistic map is kind of so it's this useful sort of illustration for showing how fairly simple iterative growth functions can kind of explode into these chaotic ways. um, and uh, and showing how, hey, if we sort of extend that idea into the complex plane, so to speak, you can see how the same story is emerging. It's just that you have kind of a different geometric representation of this similar idea. And that just might, again, that's just sort of like a speak to your audience kind of comment, that some people, the Mandelbrot set might be new to some people. So those who are familiar with the logistic map and can maybe have heard that it's related to the Mandelbrot set, they might just kind of give them something to kind of glom onto, and recognize the generality of what you're saying, and how it extends to multiple domains, multiple well, I guess literally and figuratively to multiple domains. So like um the this thing you say about rules by analogy toward the end is also really evocative and interesting. Um, I guess in the paper, it would be, I guess I'm kind of getting out of the way these sort of keep your audience in mind kind of comments. But some citations or connecting to the literature in that part of the paper might be helpful. My impression is that, like, Hofstadter is kind of big on that idea. So connecting that might give you kind of even with a quotation, because he's, rather eloquent most of the time. So it might be a useful way just to kind of make clear to your audience what it is that's so important about that idea, that and kind of nailing down how necessary sufficient conditions, kind of why they aren't enough, or why reasoning by analogy, or uh, why that analogistic sort of process is different from kind of a known endpoint. I'm kind of speaking casually now, but yeah, that's another thing. Um, you know, I think you say it at a certain point, but the fact that, like, this signal space really does nest, other more simplistic, non-fractal, quote unquote, um, signal spaces or rules, I guess saying, saying something to the effect, or making clear to your audience that this is actually the general version of something you already know about. That, you want a signal space where there's a well-defined boundary and it's like a circle or something. Yeah, we got that. That's covered. You set this meta parameter to 0, and you get all of that, and then you get a lot more than that. That might be and that's something you can kind of you kind of figure that out by reading it, but laying that out there, and also, maybe conveying those bits of information with theorems rather than, would be useful. Um, you know, I think even uh, this so, like, yeah, the nesting of that as a special case, as a theorem, would be kind of a nice self-contained way to put the matter. Something that I think will be easily readable to most economists, but also makes clear to everybody else that the homework has been done. And and so another sort of, maybe, like, theorem to state here, and I'm sure that it's been stated before somewhere else, right? So I'm pretty sure I've seen it stated in, like, a complex analysis course that I took, but I'm forgetting what the name of the theorem is. I'm not sure if it sort of has a name of a mathematician to it, like it's not a, so and so's theorem. But this idea that, um for any level of fine-grainedness, like for any nth iteration of, increasing the fidelity of the picture of the set, of the boundary, um, you have, that this probability function that you defined, the p of z and d and p and rho. You could maybe state it. You could say what you've said. You could repeat what you've said in English, and translate it into a little theorem, just by saying, for any n less than infinity, or, for any, less than infinity. You gotta say that too, I suppose. For any n that's, a finite number, you have, that probability there exists, maybe it's like that there exists a z such that, there exists a signal in the signal space such that that probability function is going to be less than 1. That might be kind of a concise way to put what you're saying, where, this ability to always go an iteration further and see a greater complexity to the boundary sort of creates a kind of uncertainty, that if you wanted to predict, whether a point is or isn't in the boundary after m more iterations or something, there's uncertainty there, you know. And stating that as a theorem just might, kind of, uh, uh, really just strengthen the whole presentation, right? Um, so I've been talking a while now. There's a lot of other stuff I have here. I guess. Okay, here's a question for you. I'll stop prognosticating comments here and ask a proper question. Is uh so the regions, these black regions in the interactive, um uh like I think I know how you've said it, but I guess I'll ask it maybe just to make it clear for everybody in the audience, is like the this divergence. So if we pick a point and you iterate forward, and where you iterate to, or the output, I suppose, if it diverges, does that mean that there's a rule that we've identified that says that action or that signal indicates like yes or no, or good or bad? Is the like where is the so you've got a signal, and it's like, suppose I wanted to put it this way, that there's a signal, and I want to know, is some sort of project profitable or not, or is it a uh uh yeah, will they pay back a loan? Let's, like, in the example that you bring up. um so if it diverges, does that mean that they won't pay the loan? And if it converges, does that mean that they do pay the loan? Or is it that if it diverges, we don't know whether it pays the loan or not? I guess maybe just so everybody is on the same page, can you um, nail down the analogy for us?
Yeah, because in standard contract incompleteness literature, the way they talk about these things is people have this reservation expectation. The way they usually model it is, given that the contract is incomplete, some specific event will happen which we might not like very much. So actual law and econ people that have meditated on this problem say, oh, well, a judge should, if the contract is incomplete, just not enforce the contract, or just set the price to zero or something like that, such that people would actually want to avoid that chaotic situation, so that they don't basically treat the court system as a common pool resource that's going to write the rest of their contract for them. So yeah, Cameron, go ahead and answer Matt's question.
Yeah, so thank you for all those suggestions. That's really, really helpful. And anything that I should be connecting to that I have not connected, definitely tell me, let me know, send it to me. That's very helpful. So the meaning of divergence. I in the loan case, I would say that divergence means that you don't get paid back. Now, there are situations where divergence is not apparent for some number of iterations, right? It might not be clear after 10, 20, even 30, 40, 50 iterations yet whether this is going to eventually diverge or not. I might interpret this as a situation where you're testing the boundaries of what you can get away with. So you imagine two kids in the back seat of a car, and little brother's going, "Yeah, I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you." How close can he get before little sister turns around and slugs you? And there's some threshold where if you do that a little bit and then back off, it's going to be fine. But if you iterate that, if you keep doing that, then you're going to get slugged. And so an evolutionarily stable uh, decision is going to be one that I can keep applying, and she's not going to slug me. Is that kind of clear?
It is. Is there at certain points, I get the impression that some of these signals are sort of uninterpretable, or give me un where does the undecidability come in, I guess? Is that all in yeah, like, here, what you've just described is sort of like, here are the regions where the binary answer to, like, will this divergent is a 0 or 1. Are there points where we don't know, and is that a matter of how many kind of how many times you go through this costly iteration? to sort of gather more information about what outcome a signal will imply, or yeah, like there's yes, there's no, and then there's not decidable, right? And so maybe where does that come in? And again, this is kind of like for the audience, I guess, but yeah.
Yeah, where does the undecidability come in? So the undecidability comes in at the boundary, where the at the boundary of a stability locus or of a rule in signal space. So this would be the proper Julia set, which is actually the border. This would be a situation where at the border, it's unclear uh, whether moving in any given direction is going to move me in or out, or whether I am already in or out. So, for example, think of yourself as an investor, and you're trying to decide whether to buy a stock. Uh, and so this is going to be the mapping from observable signals to expectations. What might you look at to figure out whether a stock is a good investment? Well, there are easy bets, right? Uh, but then efficient market hypothesis says easy bets get arbitraged away. So the only way you're going to make money is with actual difficult bets, and by looking at higher resolution than other investors are looking. So you maybe go to the board meetings, you look at the earnings reports, you comb through the balance sheets, you follow the executive team on Twitter or X or whatever, right? And you see what they're up to. And so the higher resolution you can incorporate into your decision, the more you're going to be able to form a better expectation about whether that stock is indeed going to be profitable or not. But the undecidability comes in that at any finite resolution, right, you're drawing an approximation around that stability locus, around the Julia set. And that's going to fail to capture some points that are indeed in or out. You might make a decision where you misinterpret some remark, right? I think about Alan Greenspan's irrational exuberance remark, and everybody says, oh my gosh, he's telling us something, sell, sell, sell. And then he's like, I didn't mean anything by that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, maybe he's dropping hints and trying to tell people things, but they don't believe him, and they fail to act on something he is telling them, right? That would be situations both in and out uh, of the actual stability locus. And so that mismatch between the finite approximation and the actual stability locus, where you think it's going to diverge but it doesn't, or vice versa, there's always some point close enough to the actual Julia set where any finite resolution is going to fail to be able to arrive at that decision correctly.
Okay, I want to give Kurtis a chance to talk in case he has any thoughts. I know you're really into the Doug Hofstadter analogy stuff, so I want to talk more about that too.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for this excellent paper. Yeah, I was thinking about analogy stuff, but first I want to kind of go back and look at this paper like in a different framing. Firstly, the setup is great. So you have some way of formalizing. Now it's funny because you're doing some like complexity stuff, but it really is a simple model. And then you have all these applications. So I love examples like that. Like how can we explain as much as possible with a simple model, right? And what I'm interested in are some of these more, how can we add to these applications? How can we kind of dissect these further? And so you talk about these adversarial games. I'm wondering if there's some kind of way we can formalize like moral gerrymandering. So obviously there's people on both sides of the border who would like the rule to, or like they can profit if the decision goes their way. And so even just, I mean, in the introduction, you could maybe talk about, different cases. You talked about like the glove fitting in our conversation here, but there's probably, hundreds, tons of cases at least, that you can say, well, what if we had this extra piece of evidence? How would that flip? How would that flip the sign? And um, and then how much focus each side, like each party, will have on getting that additional, like including this additional signal in this set that we're agreeing to. And so that's kind of what I was interested in. Can we say anything else about this adversarial nature where different parties are trying to capture their or try to make that resolution, one more row, or I think that or the size of row increases by one, that marginal row. Um, and maybe I'm misinterpreting how you're using this, but at least that's how I was thinking about it, is that there's parties on either side of the border who are trying to include that signal. And then also the difference in different spheres. So we talked about finance a little bit and investing. It seems like where there's big gains to be had, like in finance, we would go back and forth quicker. We'd say, oh, that one's more important, and then that one's more important. But there's other spheres where it takes a long, like EMH is true, but the time scale is just a lot longer. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. To start with.
Yeah, so this idea of moral gerrymandering, I really like that. So one of the things I talked about in the paper, for the benefit of the audience, is kind of deriving a costly signaling theory, in the sense of my ability to verify the correctness of certain signals being given off by you versus your ability to, at some cost, emit some signals that maybe mislead me. So for example, Enron falsifying their balance sheet versus my ability to say, hey, there's something fishy going on here. But this moral gerrymandering is a little different from that. And I like that because what you have here is this sense of kind of a competition over what signals we pay attention to. And this almost gets us to kind of a behavioral story where we have limited attention, right? Or limited maybe saliency bias. And so that's a really interesting way to conceptualize this. And I think of it, and that also lets you think of the adversarial nature of analogical learning. Because one thing that I've been thinking about recently, not with this paper, but separately, is the ways that people can adversarially exploit analogies. Think of, for example, if you remember a year or two ago, there was a big infrastructure bill. And then everybody, all the sharks come in and smell the blood in the water, and they say, thing that I'm on about is infrastructure. And drawing this analogy where it may or may not exist, childcare is infrastructure, paid leave is infrastructure, healthcare is infrastructure, because you get money if you can draw that analogy. And so that
My
I would
company
say
is an ESG company.
exactly, right? What counts as ESG or not, now that we have these rules for who gets money, right? And so the vulnerability to that sort of analogizing, I think, is another one of these adversarial games, right? You have to be, because if you are overly willing to update on these kinds of analogies, then the sharks come and, I should say piranhas because they're little nibbles. The piranhas come and nibble you away, and you don't survive, right? You get exploited into oblivion. Whereas if you're more skeptical, right, you can say, no, childcare is great, but it's not infrastructure or whatever, right? And then you're going to be more resistant to being exploited, and then you're going to be safer within that stability locus, as opposed to the situation where you let everybody push you off into infinity and you blow up your budget constraints. So I really like that connection to moral gerrymandering.
Yeah, it's related to some of what I've been thinking too, and related, I'm not sure how directly, to the idea of costly signaling, but some of what Kurtis and I have been working on, we've been thinking about, and this would actually have really great, I think, visual analogies to the stuff that you're doing, which is if you're designing, because the way that we've been treating it so far is like, oh, we're working in some system with some rule and we hit the border and things go chaotic, right? But people anticipate things like that. People can anticipate whether or not the decision rule that we're setting is going to converge or diverge or have chaotic results or something like that. We want it to be as predictable as possible. And when we're designing this rule, we do kind of understand this space to some degree. So in the standard costly signaling literature based on at least in econ, mostly based on Yanniconi's paper on it, is thinking about trying to get people to not be free riders on a club good. But I think that also one of the things it does that's kind of underrated is it forces people to act in certain relatively stable domains or to decide and meditate on rules which are only going to have certain signals, right? Such that we've stabilized a large portion of the signal space such that we're only moving very small distances from one another, such that it's much less likely that we're going to hit the fractal of our morality, right? So if you literally think of the Mandelbrot set as like a place that we live, right? And we want to have kids sort of play in the center so that they learn the decision rules slowly over time, and so that us as an as a kid, you're maybe for the first time going through the iterative process and everything feels new and you're learning it. But once you're an adult, hanging out in the center of the set is like old hat, you're not learning anything. But the hero or the explorers of our society are the people that venture closer and closer to the edge of the set, and maybe these people need to be trained through other methods. They can't just be told the decision rule and then told to follow the decision rule, because where they're going to go, the old tools are not going to work anymore, right? So that basically, to connect it to the costly signaling, that one of the things that costly signaling does is they're trying to make it more costly for people to explore closer to the edge of the set, such that everything else in our society continues to work, right? Basically minimize the costs of having to introduce new analogies, or minimize the costs of losing all of these potential um, how do I say it? Minimize the cost of losing coordination because someone is operating at the edge of morality. Now, what you say in the abstract of the paper is that there is then a trade-off here between predictability and certain gains from trade. And that's essentially what the explorer or the social deviant or something is saying. Like, they're like, look at all these gains from trade that you, by your morality, are leaving on the table, right? And essentially what you're giving a response to them, or at least this is how the argument would go. It's not clear exactly which side dominates. It's something like, hey, well, the reason that we're foregoing those gains from trade is so that we can maintain predictability in the rest of our actions. You don't realize what other things are dependent on. So it's very much especially given the cognitive limits idea, that we don't even understand exactly the nature of the back and forth between the decision space and the signal space. It's a very Burkean point in that, yeah, you can want to change things and wanting to improve society. There's nothing wrong in principle with that, of course, but sometimes you just simply don't realize what an individual change will do, or you don't realize what changing one rule will do by changing the rest of the process, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great metaphor, thinking of institutions as a way of pushing you away from the boundary, right? And so, kid in the back seat's trying to push the limits of where he can get close to his sister. But before he gets even close to there, as a parent, I turn around and say, hey, stay on your own side. And so we never even get close to the point where she hits him.
And I'll just say quick, because and the kid perceives that as unfair, because
Yeah.
the rule, don't touch your sibling, is the way that the parent communicates morality to the kid. And the kid kind of has to know that he's breaking the spirit of the rule, but he does feel that there's some sort of unfairness between him and the parent, because the parent seems to have added a new rule or made an arbitrary decision or falsely applied a certain rule. Whereas we know that the parent is actually reaching for something higher, more important, right? Like not annoying the sister or teaching the child to like not distress other people. But so that I think, and this is also something that Kurtis and I want to get towards, is that seems to be the trade-off in not using the decision rule at all. So when moral gerrymandering is occurring, such that someone is exploiting the way that this rule is limited, right? The way that you correct it is by breaking the rule itself, in a sense, or transcending it, or introducing a new rule, or something like that. So there's this other level of unpredictability there, which I think is because of other processes. And the way that we've started to think about it is what you've sort of assumed with the decision rule is consistency. The decisions are happening according to a consistent pattern, like an 8-year-old that's done like addition could go through every step of the iterative process. That's not what's complex about this complex math, right? And that is consistent the whole time. And so in order to correct the problems that this consistency leads you into, you have to be inconsistent. And inconsistency leads to other sorts of unpredictability than the problem with fractals.
You mind if I sort of lay just one question tack onto there? Is I think that discussion can be summarized by asking, is this a market failure? Like, are we talking about a market failure? Is this inconsistency sort of a global inconsistency? You have this great line, and this very connected to Marcus and Kurtis's work also, is that you make this distinction between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. So I don't know, is some sort of inconsistency in the letter of the law sort of needed to make the spirit consistent, or more yeah, but more precisely, is this a market failure?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Let me circle back in the long way around to this market failure question. But the letter of the law, the spirit of the law, I think is I think that's something key here, and that it does entail inconsistency in in at least any finite rule set. The original inspiration for this paper was looking at the generative process for these fractals. And what you see is that you have this process to where you generate a shape, and you have some rule for what counts and what doesn't. But then you get to the border and you see, oh, wait a minute. You need to make an exception here. You have to stick a little piece on or carve a little piece out. And then you get to the border of that, and you still got to carve a little piece out or stick a little piece on. And the border just never resolves. And so anything is going to necessarily have those inconsistencies at the border, because that's what the generative process, at least for an adversarial game, entails. Which also raises the question of kind of a moral philosophy question, right? There's some moral philosophy papers that ask the question, like, what is the thing, the real thing, the spirit of the law underneath underneath our finite length moral rules? Right? Is there a spirit of the law? Should we be moral realists? And what I want to argue here is that that thing underneath is actually evolutionary stability. That a moral rule should, at the very least, and this is not a sufficient condition, but it's a necessary condition, a moral rule should at least provide for its own continuance. Now, there's a debate recently, there's been some discourse about effective altruism and the Singer type approach to morality. And for Singer, the underlying thing, the spirit of the law, is utilitarianism, right? We want to do the most good for the most people. And my argument against that would be, is that an evolutionarily stable strategy? And if it's not, then a moral rule of always doing the most good for the most people is not going to be a rule that provides for its own persistence. And being an effective altruist today is going to impair the existence of effective altruists in the future. And so what's necessary is some sense of what is a sustainable strategy, right? Effective altruism is going to diverge, blow off to infinity. Can we find something maybe close to effective altruism, as close as you like, that does not do that? Like, what are the minimal changes to that moral rule that we have to make sure that it provides for its own persistence and is not exploitable off to infinity? that kind of where you're going with that?
With my question, yeah, I think it was, yeah. And I think that was where Marcus was going as well. I just, it's like I guess like it's another thing sort of for the audience, right? Is like calling it a market failure sort of helps ground all this stuff into like into kind of a context that may be useful. It also like you mentioned parents t telling kids in the back seat to kind of has an analog to a kind of a central planner. Is there some sort of rationale for intervention of some kind? Uh, but I think you pretty much answered that well.
Well, the market failure angle is interesting, and you're right, I didn't end up coming back to that because this would arise in these kinds of adverse selection asymmetric information cases, which are typically thought of as market failures. And maybe we can continue to think of them as market failures, although I'm not sure that that is a justification for intervention, because if anything, there is going to be more scope for judgment with private action than with regulation, which has to be at least somewhat explicit, right? It being ex post and well defined legally. And this is something that has typically annoyed me about public goods discourse too. Right? People think about public goods as a market failure, therefore the government steps in and provides them and problem solved. Well, no, because the government is itself a giant public good, right? And so if you have a government, if you can assume a government, then great, but that's not a general solution to a public goods game. And similarly, I'm not sure that intervention would be a general solution to these sorts of adverse selection problems because, well, that you're going to get adversarial exploitation of that's kind of regulation as well, regulatory capture, malicious compliance, and whatnot.
Would you say that it's fair to say, or do you think it's fair to say that um, what you're laying out here is almost neutral to those questions? Or is it because, yeah, it seems to apply to sort of like players as well as a referee, I guess, one way to put it. And uh, yeah, or is there maybe sort of a larger meta point about um, the complexity of the world being uh, too much for a central planner to handle, or or is all this kind of suggestive of that, but not quite because the yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to lay this out quite articulately, but like the logistic map and the Mandelbrot set, it is deterministic on if like but nonetheless this probability if you don't know okay, so I'll stop talking. I mean, do you think that this is neutral to those questions, or sort of does it have something of import to, the role of government more broadly?
Yeah, I think I want to think of this as neutral with respect to these questions. And maybe this would be a good time to. So, one question that has been asked about this paper is, well, what about the self-similarity aspect of fractals? And I have, to this point, not really had a good answer to that question, right? It's just not really an important.
What's the question? I don't understand. So what does
Uh,
self-similarity mean?
so the Julia set is, and the Mandelbrot set too, is self-similar. Let me share my screen one more time. Um, here we go. Yeah, so you can see here on the Julia set that that it looks like it's constructed of a piece, and then you rotate the piece, and then you make it smaller, and then you stick that on the end, and it's like as far as you zoom in, it looks similar to how it looks at a larger scale. And the Mandelbrot kind of similarly, right? You're taking this cardioid shape and then you're sticking it on top of each other on the end and all around and sticking it on top of each other, smaller pieces again. And so smaller parts kind of look like bigger parts. And I haven't done anything with that in the paper itself. But to Matt's question, uh, I have a sense, and I have not rigorously proved this, and I don't even know if you can rigorously make this analogy, but my sense is that that you could get something like self-similarity out of the fact that this is a nth order, whatever order public goods problem. You have the normal public goods problem where it's hard to prevent free riders. Easy peasy, enforcer. And you get an enforcer to make everybody not free ride, and then you solve the problem. But then how do you make the enforcer do this? And now you have a self-similar problem, just stepped up a level. And then you have constraints on the enforcer. Well, who enforces those? And no matter how many levels you go, right, you have this very, very similar problem at any kind of level. And so I get the sense that this is I don't want to say orthogonal or neutral with respect to, market versus government, but that it applies to both of them at an n+1 level, if that makes sense.
And
Yeah.
just to looking at the whole picture of the set, you can see these similarities. But when you zoom in, and if anybody at home wants to try smoking some pot and looking at the fractal zoom, it's a don't try this at home, I suppose, or try this at home, I don't know. But but yeah, you see these patterns just sort of keep showing up, and then you zoom a bit further and it's like an identical pattern will show up, and you'll see these shapes that are almost identical or sort of near identical mutations of the same general form. And you could just keep zooming and zooming and zooming, and you sort of have these recurring and I mentioned the zoom in part because that zoom phenomenon of self-similarity happens at the boundary, which is kind of exactly where it's exactly sort of where the interesting thing happen in this model or picture or whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
Yeah, can I jump in a second? I think there's the nth level public goods game is a great example for zooming in, but there's the flip side of that, which is kind of like the evolutionary niche of investments and like finding that alpha. So again, having some rule that says we'll look at these 5 signals, and these 5 signals yield, a pretty good return. But then somebody else can always come along and say, well, look at those 5 signals plus this other one, and then we're gaining. And then again, we can zoom way in. And instead of having the problem of enforcer, we're now having the problem of, I guess, extractor or something like this. So I think the self-similar actually is a interesting part of your story, namely that we can have predictions about the kinds of actions people take around these boundaries. Is that, well, no one's going to come along and jump right up to the n+600 level enforcer problem, and no one's going to, we start with these 5 signals in the investment problem. No one's going to come along and say, well, immediately we're going to look at these 100 signals. No, we're always going to have this iteration of one more on both sides of the problem. So I think that's an interesting prediction. We could look at some of these cases on some of these rule sets and say, well, where did they actually increase the granularity of the rule? And it's always right on that next little margin. And then the next one ends up just being on that next little margin. So yeah, just a thought there.
Yeah, I like that. I think that would be very excuse me. Yeah, because you're right. I mean, you don't just happen to find yourself in, the 50th lobe of the Mandelbrot or the far corner of the Julia set. You get there iteratively by exploring new signals.
One more thing I wanted to ask about. You were talking about the effective actress and the EA kind of arguments. I think you're right to say that they aren't evolutionary stable, but there's a counter argument that says, well, if we only cared about evolutionary stable rule sets or moral intuitions, then we're leaving all these gains on the table. So you do have all these gains from trade or these ways, in their case, ways we could be helping humanity or something like this. So we don't, it's hard to talk about these because do we have a meta rule for establishing how close to the boundary we want to get? Well, that's impossible because the boundary is infinitely, infinitely granular. But then you might have some kind of meta rule of how far from the center, from 0, 0, you might want to get. And I think maybe that's what Marcus was talking about of kind of reducing your domain of to cases where we can coordinate, or reducing our signal space of things we can talk about. So while I agree that I don't think EA is evolutionarily stable, there is maybe a case to say, well, no, it's not. But because there are gains to be had on the table, we should grab them when we can, because in the long run we're all dead, or because you guys aren't doing it, or because whatever. We should still take this opportunity. Not because we think that we can be as granular as possible, but because we do think we are within, one radii of the center. Yeah.
I want to jump on that because I just also read this past week. I read the Anatole Rappaport article that you cite in the paper, Cameron, just because you had recommended it to me before. Like last week, I read it, and then right after that, I read the book "The Sacred and the Profane" by Mircea Eliade, and if anyone is familiar with someone like Jordan Peterson, people think of Jordan Peterson as a Jungian thinker. That's what they always say. And that's it. Jung has definitely influenced him, but I think Mircea Eliade and his writings have influenced his way of thought much more directly. And it is exactly what Kurtis said, because the way that Eliade relates to this stuff is he talks about religious symbolism as creating a domain that one sees as sacred and ordered and stable, versus the profane, which is not things that are evil, but things that are not yet incorporated into our sacred order. So you and almost by definition, then something that is part of the set of non-ordered things doesn't have a clear definition for when it begins and when it doesn't begin, right? And so in ancient ritual, the way that you would define order is not by whether things are of this class or of that class, right? But rather by whether things are closer or further away from our totemic center, right? Or further or closer away to the ritual that we practice. So the center of the Mandelbrot set, the 0, 0 point, is like our totem pole in the middle of our village, or he says later it's like the cross in Christianity. And so he talks about, like, it's a great book because he's able to go all the way back into what we know of more primitive religions, all the way up to essentially modern Christianity. And he talks about, for example, the Spanish going into the New World and presenting the cross. They thought of themselves as bringing order to or sacredness to a fundamentally profane domain, right? So I think that's actually awesome. A way to think about it. So closeness to the center is a better way of defining order than not in the chaos, or not in the ocean or something like that. Think about the beach, for example. The land is order, the ocean is chaos, but there's waves, right? You never stand at the edge of land unless you live somewhere with like massive cliff faces, right? So if you're in the cliffs of Dover or something like that, you can feel like, yeah, I'm literally right at the edge of order. If I take one more step or take an infinitesimal step, I will fall over the edge. But if you're at a beach, you maybe have more of a sense of the chaotic part of the world is constantly lapping up against the edge of order.
Yeah, the religious history of this question is really interesting, because I think about, for example, in Catholicism, you have a pretty clear sacred, profane distinction. And there are people who are more holy than other people. And so if you want to be the most holy, you become a priest and forswear a bunch of worldly pleasures. Whereas the Protestants come along and say, no, there's actually no distinction. Everything is, or everything can be holy, everything can be sanctified. And, merchant businessman can be just as holy as the priest. And therefore, the priest doesn't have to forswear worldly pleasures because those can be sanctified too. But also, you can order everything toward that, as you say, totemic center. And so that raises the question about how can everything be so ordered? And I wonder if that's the same question here or if that's kind of orthogonal. My sense is that it would not be possible to singly order everything, that you would need some kind of distinction between sacred and profane. On the other hand, one doesn't want to necessarily make too much of that because there's obvious failure modes on both sides. But I'll throw that out there and see what you think.
Yeah, well, I'll just react to one thing quickly, your characterization of Catholicism versus Protestantism. In Catholicism, there is certainly a sense that everything can be made sacred, but not all at once, in a sense. So the purpose of something like the ascetic practice of the priest or keeping the church, the building of the church holy, is very related to what we've been talking about, in that, yeah, eventually everyone can be brought into the church in some sense, but we only do it, we don't do it all at once, because then we would be picking a decision rule which brings us immediately outside of sacred, and then we're flooded essentially. It's the best analogy is something like a flood, as opposed to the opposite, which is to treat everything as ordered, and then you end up with sort of a desert in which nothing grows. What you want is something in between, like a garden. But what another point that I wanted to bring up earlier, which is related, and this is also related, I've been talking to you about, I've been reading Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. And in a sense, one of the readings that he has of the history of Western religion, but also philosophy, is that there's this transition from when people are building ordered systems, understanding that the edges of their systems are, they wouldn't understand this formally, obviously, but are fractal-like, in that we don't have a clear boundary for when the ordered part of the world and the chaotic part of the world begins and ends, right? But to one in which we try to understand the entire world as part of a single order, or God's order, or eventually the fixed order of nature, or something like that. And the way that your paper is essentially framed is something like, you might have these decision rules which are stand-ins for morality, but given that morality is a fractal, these are going to fail in certain ways, and so much the worse for morality. And the way that a lot of people see it is actually something the opposite, where they go, well, the world must have a morality which is not going to explode. So, and it must be this one that we've received or that we've already committed to. So once you pick this decision rule, but it turns out that this edge case appears such that now the rule is ambiguous, we don't know, what we do is we just eliminate the edge case, or we cover it up, or we destroy it. And that's essentially the spirit of something like totalitarianism, which is we have these rules, and anyone that dares, it's not even just anyone that dares defect from these rules, but anyone that dares make these rules incoherent must be eliminated, right? So all of the people that don't fit a certain kind of mold, all the people that don't genuflect in front of whatever the sacred ideology at the center of that set of rules is to be immediately, in a sense, concentrated to a certain domain so that other people don't interact with them, and so those edge cases don't actually appear, something like that. And so when I was working on Kurtis and I's paper, I read a little bit of Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, and this is one of the things that she continuously refers to, is that what totalitarianism requires people to do is train them to believe in inconsistencies as if they're at the center of the ideology. And everyone's familiar with, in 1984, that what's the character's name? Winston? No, that's it's Winston, right? I thought I was thinking of C.S. Lewis, but he's required to believe that 2 + 2 = 5. That is, that the decision rule system is always generating true statements, even if they are at some level arbitrary or at some level referring to something else. He has to commit to it so that all of those edge cases are eliminated or irrelevant. So that's basically all I had to say. But that what I'm trying to say is there's so many other papers we can write.
And I think that's exactly the right way to think about totalitarianism, is the attempt um, to bring everything into consistency with a central proposition. And whether that's a political thing or whether that's a moral proposition, like I would call Singerism a totalitarian moral system, in the same sense if you tried to make that a political center, right? And what's interesting is the temptation of universalism, of and universalism and totalitarianism, maybe those are even the same thing, right? Why is that such a tempting thing to do, given that it has not always been a temptation, and given that the failure modes are so apparent? Why are we convinced that we just haven't found the right principle yet?
And closer to home for some of us coming from libertarianish circles, I've really realized that that's what turned me off ultimately to someone like Rothbard, is that what he is a libertarian totalitarian. So the non-aggression principle is just his principle that's supposed to have no fractal edges to it whatsoever, right? Um, and so when the crowd that commits hard to Rothbard is now associated with when there are these edge cases, which we're not familiar with whether or not they fit the rules. I might be mischaracterizing this a little bit, but we just sort of push them out of society, or we only want people in the libertarian society whose actions with respect to the non-aggression principle are non-arbitrary or easily predictable, right? And then everything else is free. So it feels very much of an ideology about freedom, but at the core, since it has this totalitarian attitude in it, it ends up requiring certain things that seem like they're almost the exact opposite of freedom, or very exclusionary at minimum, you might say.
Yeah, which goes some way toward explaining why it was interesting to me how as a sociological question, how the most hardline Rothbardians have been the ones that swung Trump the most out of anybody in the libertarian community. And that was always puzzling, but I think you've landed on something important here, is that arises from that sense of trying to make things consistent, which cannot necessarily be made so.
Yeah, would you guys say that Mises's action axiom is would you say that it's similar on that front, or sort of while quite logical and quite aiming at a you know it tries to make itself the basis of a logical system, but doesn't so it's formal, right? It's a real attempt at kind of a theoretical science, uh, but it is it's somewhat different in kind, I think, from Rothbard's non-aggression principle, in that that's almost kind of an inference he makes to say, well, given where I've started from, the non-aggression principle seems to be the only, universally applicable uh, rule that I could have. Anyway, I'm just, in libertarianism, I've always sensed a similar a we seem to, I say we because I would still say I'm a libertarian, but we seem to really prize that sort of logical consistency. But of course, it's very, and I think that's I'm okay with that, but I'm definitely not okay with this sort of arrival and commitment to well, to conclusions that sort of the evidence just does not bear out, and it's easy to come up with exceptions to this rule, of course. I mean, anyway, I don't know. That's just a thought.
Well, yeah, let's take this in a Popper versus Kuhn direction and philosophy of science. Because I think, and going back to the question about the temptation of the totalizing system, I think even for myself historically, the sense has been that you have to have some sort of formal logical structure to have any thought at all. And to some extent, that seems to be true, and that seems to be what Mises is trying to do, to set up a scaffolding for how we understand certain phenomena conceptually. And of course, it's different from what Rothbard's doing, because Rothbard's trying to do a moral system, and so the failure modes are a little more dire there than in a scientific system. But I see what you mean, that even for a scientific system or for a theoretical system, we'll say, the same issues would apply in that, what do you do uh, with observations that don't necessarily or that don't slot in easily to, let's say, Mises's taxonomy. And you could do carve outs at the boundary, you could ignore them, you could assimilate them, but it's not necessarily deterministic what to do with those kinds of observations. You're right.
And this is why the edgelord is such a fascinating and aptly named character.
Literally at the edges of moral space.
Yeah. I had a couple of I'll just say real quick that I'm probably finding myself most fascinated by by sort of the latent asset pricing implications of some of this. I mean, you've got a signal, and you could yeah, I mean, you bring up the loan example, right, which is a very good motivating thing. But I mean, really uh that's really very close to like what modern asset pricing often kind of does. I mean, you've got some signal, it's some risk factor, it's sometimes called. This can sometimes be the same thing as like uh, a return from a tradable portfolio, or it could just be some exogenous signal like GDP or unemployment or something, or total consumption. And from that you can kind of describe the returns in the whole cross section of the cross section of returns, and meaning the cross section of like expected returns and sort of statistical characteristics of returns among a whole big cross section of assets, by saying, well, some are very exposed to this signal, meaning some rise and fall with this signal a lot and others do not, and some have a high level of kind of idiosyncratic noise that's not related to the signal, and others, and some are sort of earning something in excess, like an alpha, to no matter what the signals are doing. And this sort of architecture is really quite general and very used. So thinking of these signals as something like a does or does not converge based on where this signal arises. And I mean, it could be quite applicable to that. So maybe it's sort of a bit too big to go into further here, I think, for the confines of this discussion. But like I do just want to get that out there, that it's rather uh I think the possibilities are quite open there. And okay, so a couple other things though, right? You mentioned this probability function, P, and the arguments are Z, D, and rho, Z being the signal, D being this decision rule that tells you where it's going to iterate to next, and rho being the how fine grained of an iteration we're going. Have I got that right? Actually, I want to make sure I'm
Yeah,
getting
that's
those.
exactly right. Rho is the resolution.
Cool, yeah. So um, so this is so I have sort of a couple of like wild comments, I guess, that sort of that are frankly kind of vague for me, but are I mean, they're vague in my mind, but I want to sort of vomit them out there. Is that so in quantum mechanics, instead of a probability function sort of being a kind of a primitive, there's this there's this thing called a probability amplitude. And so the probability amplitude is basically the value of like this wave function that is much like a probability function, but how you sort of use it to arrive at probability is you take this probability amplitude, which is a complex number, to sort of ground why I think this is relevant, is that the probability amplitude is a complex valued function, um, potentially of a complex valued variable. So you've got this complex valued variable being your signal. You can take a function of that, and you've got another complex number, and that can be a probability amplitude. And what you do is you take the modulus, that is the magnitude or the absolute value or whatever, and you square that, and that's going to be equal to the um, probability. So there's a probability amplitude that you take this transformation and you find a probability. That's at least the sort of interpretation a lot of people use. And I'm just kind of mentioning that set of tools to say that to say what? I guess just to sort of gesture toward the sort of rich set of results that pop out of using that. Namely, there's a property known as like non-commutativity, which has to do with so why would that be relevant? So something is not commutative if so if there's some operation that you say A operated on B is that it commutes if if the output is the same as B operated on A. And it's not commutative if instead you get some different value. And where this sort of arises as important in that area is that like you could you can if you observe some signal A and then observe another signal B, the conclusion that you could draw from that is basically just different from if you were to observe B and then A. So you get so I'm just going to gesture to that and leave it there just to say that there's this rich set of similar other stuff that I think takes us down a very interesting sort of rabbit hole, and it's kind of underexplored, or not underexplored, but it remains right now kind of a speculative area of mathematics, this sort of overlap and similarity between results of like Gödelian incompleteness type results, which is which you guys are all talking about, right? But there's this very interesting kind of overlap, and it's talked about in computer science, and I'll share a paper with you, Cameron. It's called and I know I've mentioned it to Kurtis and Marcus many times, but it's called From Heisenberg to Gödel via Chaitin. But it basically lays out how there are some necessary implications that have to do with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and Gödelian incompleteness. So and that may be a fruitful sort of path to go down. Sort of another kind of, you don't necessarily need to respond to this, although I'd be very interested to see, but I mentioned this before, right? Is before we started recording, is that there's this thing called stereographic projection, where you can basically a point in the complex plane can be mapped to a point on the surface of a three-dimensional sphere known as a Riemann sphere. It's a unit sphere, like a unit circle, but a sphere. And so people use stereographic projection to do things like cartography, making maps and so forth. Creating a two-dimensional representation of some geographic formation on a globe, right? And what's really neat about it is that basically you can take this signal that you're thinking has kind of a two-dimensional space that it inhabits, and there's actually this one-to-one mapping between it and a sphere, which allows you to kind of just contain more information, or have a signal present more information, and that might be useful to people who want to sort of put this idea into some kind of applied area. And and again, sort of just gesturing toward the potential similarities between this and like quantum mechanics and quantum computing, is that a qubit, which is much like a bit in computing, a one or a zero, it's this sort of bit way of expressing information. Well, the qubit is represented as a point in the Riemann sphere. So it might so therefore results in quantum computing, may sort of have interesting parallels or connections to what you're doing. And so without going further into that, I'll just sort of say why I think that's so interesting from sort of a libertarian economic perspective, right? Is that there's this analogy, and maybe I'm using, maybe I'm sort of being free-willing with an analogy like you sort of mentioned earlier. Maybe I'm saying that this is all an ESG project, what we're doing here, or something. But really this is about ESG, this whole thing. No, it's but there's this very fruitful, rich analogy between the market and a method of computational calculation, for determining which projects are what their economic meaning is and what their economic value will be, whether one should or should not undertake a project. So this is, of course, talked about a lot by, Mises and Hayek and others in the calculation debate. And without rehashing any of that, I'll just say that, like, information is really weird. Information maybe has like some kind of unexpectedly strange properties that make mapping a signal to a decision a much weirder kind of a process than the standard classical computation analogy at first suggests, right? So so perhaps the market is more like a quantum computer. Perhaps it can do operations that classical computers are slow or bad at very well. Perhaps it, and again, these are just kind of gestures and suggestions, right? But those, yeah, those tools and those ideas may be sort of have more and more legs the more as we kind of enter this AI dystopia that we're all entering, and so these ideas may be useful ways to sort of extend these Hayekian insights, and I see what you're doing as a very important and necessary step on that travel. So that's my 2 cents there.
I'll just say we should wrap up shortly, so I'll just give Cameron the last word now.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of a lot of interesting things to think about there. The market as a quantum computer. I know you've talked about quantum wave functions. I've seen you do a presentation on it, so I know you've written something on it. Could you send me something like that to give me a sense of the relevance of that? On
Sure.
on the asset pricing question, this is one reason why I am kind of sympathetic toward rational expectations as a project. And Roger Koppel, who does similar things, kind of yelled at me for this one time because he's not sympathetic toward Lucas and rational expectations in that. But I think I think the core insight of rational expectations is kind of doing a diagonalization argument to recognize the fact that the mapping from signals to expectations is not necessarily mechanical or deterministic, and that this is this same sort of incompleteness problem, right? Now, rational expectations is not it doesn't cover all aspects of that problem in the sense that it doesn't really have room for disagreement or one of the other things that Roger's been working on is frame relativity, right? Rational expectations doesn't capture that, but it does capture the non-algorithmic quality of mapping from signals to expectations. On the probability wave function stuff, you'll send me some stuff on that. But the non-commutativity point is interesting because somebody, I remember when I presented this at Markets and Society, somebody said, "Oh, have you done anything with quaternions?" And I was like, I don't know. But those are non-commutative. And so that's an interesting, this might actually make me go and see if those are relevant. Because that question of the order of the signals appearing, that would be an interesting way of operationalizing that. Yeah, and I'll go ahead and end there.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Cameron, for joining. Thanks, Kurtis and Matt, for coming on and knowing a little bit more of the math than I do. And hopefully I'll see you guys back again for something similar. This has been a lot of fun.
And thanks for having me. This has been really useful. Thank you.
Great. Bye, everyone.